Righty-ho, so this is a PowerPoint on Gerald. Now remember that Gerald is described as a man about town, and what he is again another archetype, a best example of something, and here he's the best example of that idea of an upper class man. The flaws that Gerald has are the flaws that Priestley associates with his class, and therefore we have this picture of Gerald as a man who is flawed, yes, and perhaps has some redeemable features. And if ever we have to talk about Gerald, then we're going to have to bear in mind that there are things that you're going to say that are positive about Gerald and things that are negative. The first time that Gerald is brought to our attention is again in that opening tableau, the exposition, where the characteristics and the personalities of each one of our players are made evident to us. And so what you have here is you have Gerald as a well-bred man about town, and the man about town bit links to class, that he's a man who knows he's attractive, he's a man who knows that he's a catch, he's wealthy, he's got prestige, he's got the influence that his father holds, and therefore he is a man who's at ease with himself. When you look at the character of Sheila, she is complacent. When you look at but there's a sense of uncertainty that becomes more apparent in Act 1. When you look at Eric, he's half shy, half assertive. But as for Gerald Croft, he seems quite certain with who he is. He contrasts with Eric because he has this easy confidence. But where does that easy confidence come from? It comes from his class. Again, he's been shielded from any sort of discomfort in life, and that doesn't stop him from maybe allowing other people to exist in discomfort. After all, he does exploit Eva. Okay. Whenever he speaks to Berlin and whenever Berlin speaks to him, what we get initially is this idea of his class. His class is reflected in his idiolect, in the way that he speaks. And what you have is he talks about his father as his governor. He talks about dismissing his own knowledge of port. He's not trying to impress Berlin. Berlin's trying to impress him. After all, Croft is the catch, not Berlin. When he speaks to Sheila and when she speaks to him, initially she speaks to him possessively, and as I said in the Sheila PowerPoint, perhaps this suggests some sort of over-eagerness on her part, some uncertainty about that relationship. And then Gerald asks what seems like quite a harmless question: I've been trying for long enough, haven't I, to be part of this family? And what Sheila does is she has this pointed silence, and again it suggests that he has hit a nerve, that in amongst this confident scene where he believes that he is this well-bred man about town, there is obviously some sort of tension. She speaks to him half playfully, half seriously, and again there is this understanding that their relationship perhaps is not as secure as he would expect it. After all, he says, I've been trying for long enough, haven't I? He's the one who's hiding the secret. He's the one who's been unfaithful. But it's not him. He's not the one who shows any uncertainty here. It's Sheila. And perhaps that's showing a sense of arrogance within Gerald, because even though he knows he's at fault, he's trying to cover it over. There is also too the idea that he pauses. There's the use of the hyphen there in his speech, pausing, trying to recollect whatever excuse it was that he offered last summer, and of course it was that he was busy. So with Gerald, even though he's a well-bred man about town, there is definitely some sense of tension. The niceness of this party scene that Berlin repeatedly reflects upon, that niceness perhaps is undercut by the tension that exists here between the two lovers. Okay, Berlin, when he talks to Gerald, he gives this idea that he's just the kind of son-in-law I always wanted, and what that does is perhaps hints at a sense of dissatisfaction with Eric. And again, Berlin isn't really embarrassed or annoyed, Gerald isn't really embarrassed or annoyed when Berlin turns what is meant to be the engagement speech into this capitalistic rant on what will happen with Crofts and Burlings when they work together, when they're no longer competitors but working together. And he also shows perhaps that, you know, Burling's right to say he's just the sort of son-in-law that he always wanted, because the two do seem to be made for each other. They're very much that idea of parallel characters. And you also have the idea too that Gerald shows some weakness, because whenever Burling suggests that maybe Lady Croft was disappointed in Gerald's match, that Sheila perhaps wasn't quite good enough of a catch, you know, Gerald does little to defend Sheila. He does little to dismiss that view. He's a bit hesitant in that, and that shows weakness. Okay. There is, however, this understanding that Gerald and Sheila have a relationship that is definite. You know, you have this moment where they look at each other. They take this romantic moment and they look at each other, and the tone is quiet and serious, no longer half playful, half serious as it was earlier on. And that's important, because what you need to remember is there is an emotional connection between these two. Sheila isn't the best catch for Gerald socially, apparently, and yet Gerald wants her. He wants her. And she wants him. So what you have to have is this idea that they do love each other, that there is affection there. And remember too that Mr. and Mrs. Burling are coming from a marriage where social inequality was part of it, because Mrs. Burling is Burling's social superior, and yet their connection is there. So when it comes to the idea of class and marriage, you have to admit that for Gerald and Sheila, it seems as if class and marriage class does not supersede affection, that affection is still there. Sheila had said to her mum that she wasn't going to put up with Gerald putting the business before her, just as Mrs. Burling had done, that she wasn't going to follow that sort of patriarchal line where the man's in charge. But she does in some respect, because she gets so excited about the ring that he wanted her to have. He's the one in charge of this relationship. Okay, when the inspector arrives and Gerald is introduced to the inspector, Mr. Burling uses Gerald's connection to Sir Croft as what he believes to be an influential reference, because he believes in nepotism, which is when you use your connections to win influence. So he believes that Gerald and the Croft family are influential, and therefore once the inspector realises who Gerald is, he'll obviously back off. But the inspector lets Gerald and Mr. Burling believe that for a moment, but then makes it very clear that he would prefer Gerald to stay. The fact that Gerald wants to leave, that he doesn't want to be involved in all this, again shows that weakness within Gerald. He doesn't want to be tainted by any scandal. Okay, when Burling is trying to defend his actions against Eva, Gerald really does show himself to be the kind of son-in-law that Mr. Burling always wanted. He says to Mr. Burling, well, you couldn't have done anything else. You must have denied her chance for extra money and sack her. So Gerald shows that he is a parallel character to Mr. Burling. And of course Eric shows at this very moment that he's a contrast, that he's a foil to his father, because what he does is he tries to make this empathetic connection between the higher prices of Burling's and the need for more wages for Eva. He tries to make that connection. Once Eric and the inspector and Mr. Burling leave, and Sheila and Gerald are left alone, then there's a second moment of tension there. Gerald gives himself away. He starts at the name Daisy Renton and he gives himself away. And therefore Sheila picks up on that. And I mentioned in the Sheila PowerPoint how intuitive Sheila is, how aware she is of feelings within a room and other people's feelings, because she is empathic, and that's completely different to her mother, who's completely unaware of feelings within the room. And we'll talk about that when Mrs. Burling comes back in on Sheila and and Gerald in a minute or two. So the engaged couple, when they're left alone on stage here, we've got the second moment of tension between them, because obviously Sheila knows there's something wrong. And you know, we're at the end of the first act and we've had 2 moments of tension within this engagement, and it doesn't really bode well. It doesn't bode well for the strength of this relationship or where it's going. Sheila obviously knows that Gerald knew Daisy Renton. You know, she says that he gave himself away. And Gerald then admits to what he's done wrong. He says, it was all over and done with last summer. I haven't set eyes on the girls for at least 6 months. And he admits that as if that should just be accepted, that in this this patriarchal society where the husband is superior to the wife, then she should just accept that. But Sheila knows something more than Gerald does. Her intuition allows her to understand that the inspector knows. You'll see he knows. And just at that point the inspector arrives back in, and that's the end of Act 1. So that point of tension is a crucial one, because it first of all shows that Gerald is quite dismissive of what he's done, not really taking on board Sheila's feelings, and also it lets us know that this is a serious point of tension that might prove detrimental to the relationship. So when Act 2 starts, there is that palpable tension in the room. There's that clear sense that there is underlying anger, underlying emotion and passion between these two, and it's mostly negative. And what Gerald wants to do is that he wants to get Sheila out of the room. Now, if you want to be kind to Gerald, you'll think that he wants to get Sheila out of the room because he wants to save her from any of this nasty, unpleasant detail. Or if you want to try and be more realistic, he wants to get Sheila out of the room because he does not want to show how low he is in front of her. He doesn't want to confess publicly to what he's done, which is what Mrs. Burling demands of the young idler in the end of Act 2. He's quite patronising in his attempts to get Sheila out of the room. He says that she's had an exciting and tiring day. And also too, what he does is he doesn't see any relation between the way that he's treated Eva and the way that he treats Sheila. But Sheila does. She draws a parallel between herself and Eva, because she criticises Gerald for his manly concern, his gentlemanly concern here, the wanting to protect her from unpleasant and disturbing things. But he didn't want to protect Eva from unpleasant and disturbing things like downing a bottle of bleach and burning your insides out. So what you have here is perhaps this dismissive attitude that he has is less associated with class and more associated with his attitude towards women. That might be something that you'd like to think about. Gerald then shows that he doesn't really know Sheila very much, because he thinks that she wants to stay to see somebody else put through it. And in fact, he believes, as Sheila says, that you think that Gerald thinks that Sheila is just some sort of vain and vindictive character, or creature rather. And it shows a lack of understanding between these two. To be so negative, to think so little of your partner, especially when you're the one in the wrong, especially when Gerald is the one who is guilty, and yet he wants to put that sense of being guilty upon Sheila. Sheila's guilty of wanting to see him suffer. I think that perhaps is something to bear in mind, because again that shows weakness in Gerald, that he tries to dismiss the responsibility here, tries to avoid responsibility. It seems as if self-awareness for Gerald is decidedly lacking. The inspector has an understanding about Sheila and Gerald that if they're going to mend this broken relationship, that they need to share something, and even if that sharing is sharing guilt, that might be a start. Sheila returns the ring because it doesn't mean anything to her. The economic value is no longer important. She's no longer blinded by its sparkles. That she understands that she and Gerald need to get to know each other if there's going to be any hope. And the point is that Gerald doesn't argue with that, and in fact what he does is he humbly asks that can he come back again. And to be fair to Gerald, that makes us think at this point that really he loves Sheila, that he wants Sheila and not just a wife, that he's willing to give her time, he's willing to allow this relationship to heal in some way. And you know, those are all very positive things. So when Gerald does leave in Act 2, he leaves with, yes, we're ashamed of how he behaved. Yes, we hold him responsible for his exploitation of a vulnerable girl at a time in her life when she needed help and she needed guidance. But there is also that idea that perhaps he can be a worthwhile lover and partner for Sheila because he humbly asks to return. But then what happens in Act 3 when he comes back is we realise how wrong we were about that we feel cheated by Gerald a second time. And perhaps that's Priestley's way of letting us know that he and the class that he represents will constantly be associated with these sort of false hopes, false dawns, that they will constantly just repeat the same mistakes. In Gerald's confession, there seems to be a moment of understanding because Sheila understands Gerald better than he does himself. Sheila realises that he's a vain creature, that he would have loved the fact that Sheila was devoted to him, that Eva was devoted to him. That would have appealed very much to Gerald's ego. And it seems as if Gerald is going to take responsibility for his selfishness because he says, all right, I did for a time. And perhaps that's his first step towards understanding himself, being self-aware. But we have to remember is that all these little steps that Gerald takes towards self-awareness, towards accepting responsibility, are all steps that are forgotten by the time we get to Act 3. There's a maturity in the way that Sheila handles Gerald's conversation. She asks questions in a controlled manner. It's Mrs. Burling who acts in an immature way. She calls it a disgusting affair. She says it's a disgusting affair. He says it wasn't disgusting, and she says, well, it's disgusting to me. And again, Mrs. Burling acts as if it's herself that has been injured by Gerald's philandering ways, not her daughter. Again, indication of Mrs. Burling's selfishness, lack of self-awareness. Okay. Gerald says that Eva was very gallant about it when he told her that it had to end. And gallant is a word that would usually be associated with a romantic hero, usually associated with, you know, your knight in shining armour. And also a gallant in Elizabethan theatre was a very well-dressed man about town. So you could use that word in both, I suppose, connotations in both contexts, but really here there is a sense of irony because it's usually the man, the hero, who is gallant, but here it's Eva who is. It's as if Eva were that sort of self-sacrificing individual that you would expect a gentleman to be. What you have here is this idea that Gerald and Burling and Sheila all represent Daisy or Eva as this character that has grace, that has decorum, that knows how to handle herself in a way that suggests that she is better than the problems that beset her. And what you have is Eva as a symbol of the unspoken dignity of the oppressed. She's flawless. And J.B. Priestley wants to present her as such because she represents the underdog, the common man, that segment in society that is used and abused by the upper and middle classes, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to expose that society as flawless. Now that's not realistic, that's not a realistic portrayal, but remember what Priestley is doing is he's trying to sell you a political message, and so realism perhaps is not necessarily what he wants to bring into that portrayal of Eva. With Eva Smith then, Gerald makes it very clear that she is strong, has inner strength, and she's emotionally vulnerable. And what we have is that sense of her emotional vulnerability finally sort of wears away her inner strength, and she takes the only course open to her, which is suicide. And that's because of everything that the Burlings have done to her, everything that life has thrown at her. When Gerald leaves, as I said before, he leaves perhaps not so much as under a cloud, but he leaves with that little ray of hope, that he will come back and try to make things right with Sheila, that he wants Sheila, that he loves her. And he leaves when he says, it's affected him, the death has affected him more than he thought. And his language is quite fractured there, quite a lot of use of the hyphen. And, we could be on a good day, we could be sympathetic for Gerald when he leaves. And therefore, when he comes back, we are betrayed by Gerald. We did not think that he left just to undermine the inspector. We thought he left because he was finally accepting his responsibility, but that's not the case. We've been tricked, we've been had, just like when Berlin says about the inspector that we've been had. We as an audience have been had by by Gerald, and I think that trick feels just even more uncomfortable because we did have that little inkling of sympathy for him. When Berlin gets the door, when the door is opened and Gerald comes in, we have this idea that he becomes this focus in the final act, because what he did was he wanted to find out about the inspector. He wanted to undermine the inspector. So if we have a look here, what we find out is that from his encounter with Eva, he was happy to undertake a sexual relationship without being in love. He was happy enough to undertake a sexual relationship where money was involved, where a young girl was exploited, and those things are hard to swallow. You also have to remember with Gerald, he took her to the County Palace Hotel when he knew it would be quiet. How did he know it was quiet? Had he been there before? Perhaps it would suggest that he had. When Gerald leaves, we don't understand, or we don't think that his motivation is to find out about the inspector, to carry out his own interrogation. And therefore we really do feel betrayed by him. But what you have too is this idea that perhaps we see him clearly for who he is. Then we see him clearly for the idea that he is a man who is focused on self-interest. Did he want to find out who the inspector was because he wanted to save Mr. Berlin from social scandal, or he wanted to protect his fiancée? No, it doesn't seem like that. Again, it seems quite self-serving. Okay, so it's Gerald who tries to push through the logic of what might have happened. He makes the connection between a girl and the same girl, and when he delivers his theory, he looks around triumphantly, and it reminds us of what Sheila said to Gerald in Act 2, that he must have loved being the Prince Charming, just as he loves here triumphantly being the centre of attention. It appeals to his vanity, and it's always his vanity that undermines his character. Just as Eva looked to him as his saviour, Gerald uses logic to be the White Knight for the Berlin family. He truly is the son-in-law that Mr. Berlin always wanted. What Gerald does is he represents the easy way out. He plays that devil's advocate position. Well, what if it were not the same girl? He does that. And why does he look for the easy way out? Because it means avoiding responsibility. He can lie convincingly. He can sort of like compartmentalise his life. Okay, yes, I had an affair, but that was last summer. We're here now, Sheila, as if that somehow doesn't matter. What you have with Gerald is, in the play, the inspector, being the mouthpiece of Priestley, talks about a chain of events, about how things are interlinked. But Gerald sees his place. He sees his past and he sees his future. And he doesn't really make any connections between his past. He doesn't think that his past is going to affect him today in his relationship with Sheila. And he certainly doesn't think it's going to protect him or it's going to have any effect on him in the future. He doesn't link up his actions. He just has this idea that he'll get away with whatever he needs to get away with. And if that's lying or being unfaithful, well then that's fine. You also have this idea too that when he's on the phone to ring up about if there's been anyone who has committed suicide that day, he rings up and he says that he's rather worried about one of his employees, and I think that's a dark moment of irony, as if Croft would be worrying about that. You also have that idea too that Burling has high praise for Gerald and for everything that Gerald has done. He is a morally reprehensible capitalist, does everything that, that Priestley stands against, but everything that Burling stands for. So when we're thinking about Gerald, there are good points and there are bad points, and it's really up to you to bring those to the fore. I would say that primarily Gerald is a selfish character. He has moments where perhaps you could suggest that his love and true affection for Sheila are apparent, but when it comes down to it, what does he do in the end? At the end of it all, he offers Sheila the ring back, as if what happened in the past doesn't matter anymore. And she'd already said to him, we need to get to know each other again. But obviously he doesn't listen, because as soon as he thinks he's vindicated, as soon as he thinks he's exposed the inspector as a fraud, he offers her the ring back. So he doesn't want to get to know her again. He just wants his ego to be served by her saying, oh, Gerald, my hero, yes, let's get married. So it would be, I think, easier to see Gerald as a character, a negative character with some plus points, rather than a plus character with a few negative.